March 17th, 1943. Lyon, France. Gestapo headquarters. Rue Berthelot. Oberfinanzer Heinrich Keller stands before a confiscated quilt spread across an examination table, studying the pattern of fabric patches with growing frustration. The quilt measures approximately 140 centimeters by 210 centimeters, pieced together from what appears to be scrap fabric, cotton prints, wool remnants, sections of worn linen. The stitching is crude but functional. The color palette is chaotic, faded blues next to vivid reds, pale yellows adjacent to deep greens. No aesthetic coherence whatsoever. It is, Keller thinks, exactly the sort of peasant craft one would expect from an elderly French seamstress with poor taste and limited resources. He has been studying quilts like this for 6 weeks. The Gestapo has intercepted 43 similar quilts traveling through checkpoints across the Lyon region, all bound for different addresses. All confiscated because Gestapo intelligence suspects French resistance forces are using quilts to smuggle coded messages. The theory makes sense. Quilts are innocuous, common, easily explained. An aunt sends a quilt to a niece. A daughter sends one to her elderly mother. No German soldier questions quilts. But Keller's team has examined each confiscated quilt exhaustively. They have photographed the patterns, analyzed the stitching, tested for invisible inks, held the fabric under ultraviolet light, even unstitched several quilts completely to check for hidden documents sewn inside layers. Nothing. No codes, no messages, no concealed materials. Just poorly made quilts. Keller is beginning to think the intelligence was wrong, that the resistance isn't using quilts at all, that his team has wasted 6 weeks confiscating bedding from innocent French civilians. Except for one detail that troubles him. Every single quilt originated from the same source, a seamstress shop in the Croix-Rousse district, Elise Dubois. Proprietor, Madame Elise Dubois, age 61. Widow. No political affiliations. No resistance connections identified. She makes quilts from donated scrap fabric and sells them cheaply to supplement her late husband's pension. 43 quilts in 6 weeks. All from the same seamstress. All traveling to different addresses across the region. Keller picks up a magnifying glass and examines the stitching more closely. The thread is cotton, nothing unusual. The knots are standard. The spacing between stitches varies, sometimes tight, sometimes loose. Consistent with handwork by someone with failing eyesight. He steps back and looks at the overall pattern. Geometric shapes. Squares and triangles arranged in seemingly random configuration. This particular quilt has a section of blue patches in the upper left, a cluster of red patches near center, scattered yellow patches along the right edge. There is no pattern, no symmetry, no design logic, unless... Keller returns to his desk and retrieves a map of the Lyon region. He spreads it beside the quilt. He's attempted this correlation before with other confiscated quilts, looking for geographic patterns encoded in the fabric layouts. He found nothing convincing, but this time he tries something different. Instead of looking at colors, he looks at shapes, at the specific geometric configurations of patches. The blue section in the upper left. 5 patches arranged in an L shape. On the map, the Saône River runs through northwestern Lyon in a similar configuration. Coincidence. The red cluster near center, 7 patches forming an irregular star pattern. On the map, the Place Bellecour, Lyon's central square, is a similar shape. Coincidence. Except Keller doesn't believe in coincidences anymore. Not after 3 years hunting resistance networks. He pulls out photographs of the other 42 quilts. He begins comparing patterns to map features. Rivers, roads, rail lines, town squares, bridges. Some quilts show no obvious correlation, but others. Quilt number 17, intercepted March 2nd. Bound for an address in Villeurbanne. The pattern shows a long diagonal line of dark patches crossing from upper right to lower left. On the map, the main rail line from Lyon to Geneva runs in precisely that orientation. Quilt number 29, intercepted March 9th, bound for an address in Vienne. The pattern shows a curved line of green patches along the bottom edge. On the map, the Rhone River curves along the southern boundary of the region in an identical arc. Keller's hands begin to tremble slightly. Not from fear, from excitement. Madame Dubois isn't hiding codes in her quilts. She's hiding maps, actual geographic representations of the Lyon region, disguised as decorative patchwork patterns. Each quilt shows different features, different routes, different safe houses marked by specific patch colors at specific intersections. The resistance has been smuggling complete navigation guides through Gestapo checkpoints, right past trained intelligence officers. Disguised as ugly quilts, Keller reaches for the telephone. He dials Gestapo headquarters. When the duty officer answers, Keller speaks clearly. Arrest Madame Elise Dubois, Atelier Dubois, Croix-Rousse district. Immediately, what Keller doesn't know, what he cannot possibly realize as he issues the arrest order, is that Elise Dubois has already gone underground. Warned by a sympathetic French policeman 15 minutes earlier that Gestapo was requesting arrest authorization. She is currently 3 kilometers away, already carrying papers identifying her as Madame Claire Fontaine, already on her way to a safe house in Uhlans. And what Keller definitely doesn't know is that Elise spent last night sewing her final quilt, the most important one, showing every resistance route, every safe house, every weapons cache in the entire Lyon region. That quilt was delivered this morning to Jean Moulin, leader of the unified French resistance, who is using it right now to plan operations that will disrupt German occupation for the next 8 months. Sometimes the most dangerous weapons aren't guns or explosives. Sometimes they're needles and thread in the hands of a woman who understands that the Gestapo trains its officers to find sophisticated codes but never trains them to read the language of fabric. The Germans will spend 3 months analyzing Elise's quilt patterns, trying to decode messages that aren't codes at all, just maps. Sewn by a seamstress who realized that if you make something look ugly enough, crude enough, pedestrian enough, the Germans will examine it and dismiss it and wave it through checkpoints because highly trained intelligence officers cannot conceive that strategic intelligence could be hidden in something so aesthetically worthless. Elise Dubois is a 61-year-old widow with arthritic hands and deteriorating eyesight. Over the next 18 months, her quilt mapping system will guide approximately 1,200 resistance fighters to safe locations, facilitate 37 weapons deliveries, and help coordinate 8 major sabotage operations. And she will do it all by being exactly what the Germans expect: a poor French seamstress making ugly quilts from scrap fabric. Understanding how Elise Dubois created her mapping system requires understanding the craft of quilting itself, specifically the patchwork technique common in rural France during the 1940s. Traditional patchwork quilts are constructed from small fabric pieces, patches, sewn together to create larger patterns. The technique originated as practical necessity. In an era before mass-produced textiles, nothing was wasted. Worn clothing was cut into patches. Fabric scraps were salvaged. These pieces were assembled into quilts that provided warmth and used every scrap of available material. By 1943, under German occupation, fabric is severely rationed. New cloth is nearly impossible for civilians to obtain. French families repair and reuse everything. A torn dress becomes patches for a quilt. Worn curtains become backing fabric. Old blankets are unraveled and rewoven. In this context, patchwork quilts are utterly ordinary. Every household has them. Every seamstress makes them. They are invisible in their ubiquity. Elise Dubois understands this better than most. She has been a seamstress for 43 years, since age 18, when she apprenticed with a dressmaker in Rouen. She learned pattern making, fabric cutting, and the geometric precision required to construct clothing that fits properly. She understands how shapes tessellate, how angles align, how to translate three-dimensional forms into two-dimensional patterns. When her husband Pierre dies in December 1941, pneumonia complicated by malnutrition, Elise needs income. At age 59, with arthritic hands and no children to support her, she opens a small seamstress shop in Croix-Rousse, the historic silk weaving district of Lyon. She takes in mending, alters clothing, and makes quilts from donated fabric scraps. The Germans have occupied Lyon since November 1942. The Gestapo establishes headquarters on Rue Berthelot. Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, arrives to command the local security apparatus. The occupation is brutal. Arrests, torture, deportations. The resistance operates but carefully. Discovery means death. Elise has no connection to resistance networks initially. She is simply a seamstress trying to survive. But in January 1943, a young man enters her shop. He is perhaps 25 years old, nervous, clearly uncomfortable. He asks if she can repair a torn jacket. While she examines the damage, he speaks quietly. "Madam, I understand you make quilts." "Yes," she replies. "I was wondering," he continues, "if you might make one for my mother. She lives in Villeurbanne. I would like to surprise her." The request is ordinary, but the young man's eyes are not. He is watching her intently, evaluating her reaction. Elise understands. The young man is resistance. This is a test, an approach, an evaluation of whether she can be trusted. She chooses her words carefully. "I would be happy to make a quilt for your mother. Does she have a favorite pattern?" The young man relaxes slightly. Perhaps something that reminds her of home, of the places she knows, the streets and squares, the river. Elise understands completely. He is asking if she can create a map disguised as a quilt. She makes her decision instantly. "I think I understand exactly what your mother would appreciate. Give me 1 week." The young man leaves. Elise locks her shop door and spreads a city map of Lyon across her work table. She studies it carefully. The Saône River, the Rhône River, major streets, the Place Bellecour, key landmarks. Then she begins selecting fabric patches. Blue for waterways, gray for major roads, red for important squares. She arranges the patches on backing fabric, creating a loose geographic representation of central Lyon. The rivers flow in correct relative positions. The central square appears where it should, but the overall composition looks like a chaotic patchwork quilt with no obvious pattern. She sews the patches together using basic quilting stitches. No special techniques, no hidden codes, just straightforward construction. When finished, the quilt is ugly by aesthetic standards. Colors clash, shapes don't balance. But if you know to look for geographic correlation, if you compare the patch layout to a map, the correspondence is unmistakable. The young man returns 1 week later. Elise shows him the quilt. He studies it for perhaps 30 seconds. His expression remains neutral. Then he smiles. "My mother will love this." She appreciates attention to detail. He pays her 50 francs, far more than the quilt is worth, and leaves. Elise never sees him again. But 4 days later, another person enters her shop. Then another. Then 3 more. All requesting quilts, all using similar careful language, all resistance. By March 1943, Elise is producing approximately 3 quilts per week. Each one encodes different information: routes between safe houses, railroad lines for sabotage targeting, German patrol patterns represented as repeating geometric motifs, locations of weapons caches marked by specific colored patches at specific grid positions. The system is brilliant Because it exploits German assumptions. The Gestapo expects coded messages to be sophisticated. Substitution ciphers. Book codes. Invisible inks. They train officers to recognize these techniques. They never train officers to read quilts. Elise varies her patterns carefully. Some quilts are obvious maps that reveal their secrets quickly once the viewer understands the system. These go to experienced resistance fighters who need rapid intelligence. Other quilts are more abstract, requiring careful comparison to actual maps to decode. These carry more sensitive information, ensuring that even if intercepted, the intelligence isn't immediately accessible. She also creates decoy quilts, pieces with no encoded information whatsoever. Just random patchwork. These are distributed to confuse surveillance, making it harder for Germans to identify which quilts matter. The resistance pays her modestly for materials and time. She doesn't do this for money. She does it because Pierre died under German occupation, because she has skills the resistance needs, because she is 61 years old and invisible to young German soldiers who see only an elderly French seamstress. By mid-March, Elise has produced 47 quilts. The Gestapo has intercepted 43. They study them exhaustively and find nothing because they are looking for codes, not geography. Heinrich Keller is the first German officer to realize what he's looking at. But by the time he orders Elise's arrest, she is already gone, warned by Marcel Jobert, a French policeman who has been feeding intelligence to the resistance for 8 months. Elise Dubois was born Elise Marchand on June 9, 1881, in the village of Renaison, a small community in the Loire region north of Lyon. Her father was a farmer. Her mother took in sewing to supplement the family income. Elise learned basic stitching as a child, helping her mother with repairs and alterations. At age 14, she showed sufficient skill that her parents arranged an apprenticeship with Madame Thérèse Vacher, a dressmaker in Rouen, the nearest substantial town. Elise spent 4 years learning pattern making, fabric cutting, garment construction. She proved talented, particularly at complex geometric patterns. By age 19, she was creating dress patterns independently, translating measurements and body shapes into precise fabric templates. In 1900, at age 19, she married Pierre Dubois, a textile worker at a Rouen fabric mill. They moved to Lyon in 1902, where Pierre found employment at a silk weaving factory in Croix-Rousse. Elise worked as a seamstress, taking commissions from Lyon's bourgeois families. They had one child, a son named Antoine, born in 1904. Antoine died at age 17 in October 1918 during the final month of the First World War, from influenza during the Great Pandemic that killed millions across Europe. After Antoine's death, Elise withdrew from public life for several years. She continued working but took fewer commissions. Pierre's income from the factory supported them adequately. They lived quietly in a small apartment on Monte Saint-Sébastien, a steep street in Croix-Rousse overlooking the city. The decades passed. Lyon grew and modernized. The silk industry declined as synthetic fabrics replaced natural materials. Pierre's factory reduced its workforce. By 1935, Pierre was earning barely enough to cover rent and food. Elise took in more mending work, repaired clothing for neighbors, made quilts from scrap fabric to supplement their income. When Pierre died in December 1941, Elise was 59 years old, with minimal savings and no pension. The German occupation had devastated Lyon's economy. Fabric was rationed, food was scarce. Elise opened her small shop, advertising, mending, and alteration services. The quilts were almost an afterthought, something to do with fabric scraps, something that might sell for a few francs. She never imagined those quilts would become weapons. The young man who first approached her in January 1943 was named Thomas Moreau, a courier for the Combat Resistance Network. Combat was one of several resistance organizations operating in Lyon, coordinating sabotage, intelligence gathering, and support for Allied operations. Lyon was critical to the resistance. The city sat at the confluence of the Saône and Rhône rivers, a transportation hub connecting northern and southern France. German military traffic moved through Lyon constantly. Occupation forces maintained significant presence. But Lyon was also large enough, complex enough, that resistance networks could operate with some concealment. The challenge was coordination. Resistance cells needed to communicate. They needed maps showing safe houses, escape routes, German patrol patterns. But any documentation was dangerous. Captured papers meant arrests, torture, executions. Thomas Moreau was looking for a solution when he noticed Madame Dubois' shop. He observed her for 2 weeks. Elderly, quiet, no obvious German contacts. He decided to risk an approach. When Elise delivered that first quilt, the one showing basic Lyon geography, Thomas recognized immediately what he was seeing. He brought it to his commander, a former army officer named Captain Jean Leclerc. Leclerc studied the quilt for several minutes, then smiled. "This is extraordinary. Can she make more?" Thomas returned to Elise's shop. Over the next weeks, they developed protocols. Requests would come through intermediaries, people who appeared to be ordinary customers. Each request would specify information needs using carefully coded language. Elise would translate those needs into quilt patterns. A quilt bound for Villeurbanne would show routes between Lyon and that suburb. A quilt bound for Vienne would show southern approaches to the city. A quilt bound to an address in the first arrondissement would show central city safe houses. If intercepted, the quilts would appear to be exactly what they were. Patchwork quilts made from scrap fabric, ugly but harmless. The system worked perfectly until mid-March, when Heinrich Keller finally recognized the geographic correlation. But by then, dozens of quilts had already reached their destinations, providing resistance networks with intelligence that would guide operations throughout the spring and summer of 1943. When Marcel Jobert warns Elise that the Gestapo plans to arrest her, she has approximately 20 minutes to act. She grabs a small bag containing false identity papers prepared weeks earlier by the resistance as a precaution. She takes her sewing kit, some thread, needles, and basic supplies. She leaves everything else: the shop, her few possessions, the life she built over 4 decades. She walks quickly but not frantically toward Place Sathané. A young woman she recognizes from previous brief encounters approaches casually. They do not acknowledge each other. The young woman drops a folded paper. Elise retrieves it seconds later. The paper contains an address in Oullins, a suburb southwest of Lyon. Elise takes the tram, paying her fare, sitting among other passengers, appearing to be simply another elderly woman running errands. She exits at Oullins and walks 6 blocks to the address. A row house, modest, unremarkable. She knocks. The door opens. A middle-aged man studies her briefly, then steps aside. "Welcome, Madame Fontaine." The safe house is operated by a Catholic priest named Father Michel Arnaud, who has been hiding refugees and resistance fighters since early 1942. Elise will remain there for 3 weeks before moving to a farm north of Lyon. But during those 3 weeks, she continues sewing. Father Arnaud provides fabric scraps. Elise creates her most important quilt. The master map. This quilt measures 180 centimeters by 240 centimeters, larger than her previous work. It shows the entire Lyon region, every resistance safe house she knows, every weapons cache location, every recommended escape route, every German checkpoint location marked by specific colored patches. She uses a sophisticated encoding scheme for this quilt. Colors represent different types of locations. Blue patches mark safe houses. Red patches mark German positions. Green patches mark supply caches. Yellow patches mark emergency meeting points. The positions of patches relative to each other mirror actual geography with reasonable accuracy. Additionally, she incorporates a key system, small symbols stitched into certain patches, barely visible unless you know to look for them. A tiny cross stitched in one corner indicates the quilt's orientation relative to north. Small circles indicate primary routes. Small squares indicate secondary routes. The quilt takes her 6 days, working approximately 12 hours daily. Her arthritic hands swell painfully. She ignores the pain. This quilt represents everything she has learned over 3 months of creating map quilts. Every technique refined, every encoding method optimized. It is both map and legend, providing complete intelligence for Lyon resistance operations. On March 28, 1943, a courier arrives at Father Arnaud's safe house. He is perhaps 40 years old, distinguished, wearing a worn but well-tailored suit. Father Arnaud introduces him as Monsieur Mercier. Elise recognizes the name immediately. Jean Moulin, using one of his aliases, the man coordinating all French resistance networks under Charles de Gaulle's Free French Command. Moulin examines the quilt carefully. He spreads it across a table, studying the patterns. After several minutes, he looks at Elise. Madame Dubois, this is exceptional work. How accurate are the positions? Elise has prepared a standard city map marked with her best estimates of positions. She shows it to Moulin. The quilt patterns correspond to these locations. I estimate accuracy within approximately 200 meters for most positions. Some locations I marked from memory may be less precise. Moulin compares the map to the quilt. He traces routes with his finger, matching fabric patterns to geographic features. His expression grows more impressed. You've created a complete intelligence summary in a format that appears completely innocuous. The Germans could examine this for hours and see only an ugly quilt. That is the intention, monsieur. Moulin carefully folds the quilt. This will be invaluable. May I ask what inspired this technique? Elise considers her answer. I am a seamstress. I understand patterns and how shapes fit together. The Germans understand codes and ciphers. They do not understand fabric. I simply worked within a language they do not speak. Moulin smiles. The best intelligence tradecraft often relies on exactly that principle. Operating in spaces the enemy does not think to examine. You have my sincere gratitude, madame. He departs with the quilt. Elise never sees it again. But over the following months, she learns that her work guided numerous resistance operations. Safe house networks coordinated using her maps. Sabotage teams navigating using routes she documented. Supply caches located through her encoded positions. The Gestapo searches for her intensively. They raid her shop, interrogate neighbors, monitor rail stations and checkpoints. They analyze the confiscated quilts, eventually recognizing the geographic encoding. But by then, Elise is using different names, moving between safe houses, continuing her work on a smaller scale. She produces approximately 18 more quilts between April and December 1943. These go to resistance networks in other cities: Marseille, Toulouse, Grenoble, each quilt adapted to local geography. Each one smuggled through checkpoints disguised as an innocent gift from an elderly aunt or mother. The Germans never catch her. Heinrich Keller spends months trying to track her down. He identifies several of her safe houses, but always arrives days too late. Elise stays ahead of the Gestapo through careful movement, through the support of resistance networks who prioritize her protection because her intelligence work is too valuable to lose. April 6th, 1944, 1 year after her escape from Lyon. Elise is living in a farmhouse near Bourg-en-Bresse, 60 kilometers northeast of Lyon. She receives word through resistance channels that Allied forces are planning major operations in France. D-Day is coming, though the exact date remains classified. The resistance needs updated intelligence maps for coordinated uprisings to support the invasion. Elise, now using the name Madame Sophie Laurent, begins work on a new series of quilts, 12 in total, each one documenting a different region of eastern France. Rail lines for sabotage, German garrison locations, supply depots, communication networks. She works with increased urgency. Her hands are worse now, the arthritis progressing. She can manage only a few hours of sewing each day before the pain becomes unbearable. But she continues, thread by thread, patch by patch, translating intelligence into fabric. By early June, she has completed 8 quilts. They are distributed to resistance networks across the region. When D-Day occurs on June 6, 1944, resistance forces across France rise in coordinated uprisings, using intelligence that Elise and others like her gathered and documented through months of dangerous work. The Lyon region sees particularly effective resistance coordination. German communication lines are cut, rail lines sabotaged, convoys ambushed. Much of this success traces back to intelligence originally encoded in Elise's quilts, information that resistance networks have been using and updating for over a year. The Germans never recover from the coordinated disruption. As Allied forces advance from Normandy, resistance networks harass German retreats, using mapped intelligence to predict routes, ambush convoys, and accelerate the liberation of France. Lyon is liberated on September 3, 1944. Free French forces enter the city. The Gestapo headquarters on Rue Berthelot is abandoned, files burned, prisoners executed before the Germans fled. Elise returns to Lyon on September 10th. Her shop on Monte Saint-Sébastien was looted during the occupation, but remains structurally intact. She reopens slowly, re-establishing her seamstress business. She tells no one about the quilts. Resistance members who know her role maintain silence. The work was clandestine. It remains clandestine. In November 1944, a French intelligence officer visits her shop. He is young, perhaps 28, wearing a new uniform. He introduces himself as Lieutenant André Clement, assigned to document resistance activities for official records. He asks if she is Madame Elise Dubois, who created encoded quilts for resistance networks. Elise hesitates, then confirms. The officer explains that her work is being considered for official recognition. Would she be willing to provide details for intelligence archives? Elise declines politely. I was simply a seamstress making quilts. Many people did far braver things. I would prefer not to claim attention that belongs to those who fought and died. Lieutenant Clement respects her wishes, but he leaves a document, a letter signed by Jean Moulin before his arrest and death in July 1943. The letter commends Madame Dubois for extraordinary intelligence work, for developing innovative methods that allowed resistance networks to coordinate effectively while evading German surveillance, for providing critical intelligence that saved lives and supported operations across multiple regions. Moulin's letter concludes with a simple statement. In a war, fought with tanks and aircraft and armies, sometimes the most valuable weapons are wielded by those the enemy never thinks to watch. Madame Dubois proved that a seamstress with needle and thread can be as effective as a soldier with a rifle. France owes her a debt that official recognition can never fully repay. Elise keeps the letter in a drawer and never speaks of it publicly. She continues working as a seamstress until 1952, when arthritis forces her retirement. She lives quietly, supported by a small government pension. She makes no claims about her wartime service. She dies in March 1958 at age 76. Her obituary describes her as a seamstress and widow. It does not mention quilts or resistance work or the hundreds of lives her maps helped save. Her shop is eventually demolished during urban renewal. Her quilts, those that survived the war, are scattered. Most were destroyed or lost. A few remain in private collections, their true purpose unknown to current owners who see only faded patchwork fabric. But in French intelligence archives, in classified reports documenting resistance operations, Elise Dubois is remembered. The seamstress who turned quilting into cartography, who understood that the most effective codes are sometimes not codes at all, but information hidden in contexts the enemy never examines. The Germans trained their officers to recognize substitution ciphers and book codes and invisible inks. They never trained anyone to read geography stitched into fabric by an elderly woman with arthritic hands. That blindness, that assumption that strategic intelligence must look sophisticated and complex, cost them months of operational effectiveness. It allowed resistance networks to coordinate. It enabled sabotage operations. It contributed to the eventual liberation of France. And it all began because one seamstress, grieving her husband and her son and her occupied country, realized that she could fight back with the only weapons she possessed: needles and thread, and an understanding of how to hide maps in patches of fabric that the Gestapo would dismiss as worthless peasant craft. Sometimes wars are won by generals moving armies across continents. Sometimes they are won by seamstresses moving needles across quilts, one stitch at a time, encoding intelligence in patterns that only those who know how to look can see.